Hey everyone! I'm starting a little early today because I finished with work a little early as well. Molly is downstairs with her daddy. She did not want to come upstairs today, so we have a sleepy Jäger instead. So I guess today would be called Story Time with Auntie and Jäger. So we're going to pick up where we left off yesterday. Chapter 6 of The Prince and the Thieves. Sorry. They were shocked, and they frantically looked all around. The boy's sword and his crown lay below on the ground. Then 5 thieves sauntered out from the places they'd lurked. They looked up at the boy and the dog, and they smirked. Leaping down from a tree, the boss joined his 5 thieves and discovered the crown lying there in the leaves. Now we've reached the same point where our story began, and I wish I could say that the pair had a plan. But our friends were quite caught, like 2 flies in a web. It was here that their fortunes had reached a low ebb. Jäger! Jäger! I guess I have to bribe him with cookies. Hang on. Yeah, I'm bribing you. Go lay down to bed. Go to bed. There you go. Okay. Yes, you're being very nice. There you go. Good boy. Okay. Back to our story. Then the boss wrote a note he addressed to the king, and he greedily thought of the ransom they'd bring. And just how did this thief send the note, you might ask? He assigned their poor pigeon that unpleasant task, and the note that the pigeon conveyed told the king when and where they could meet for the trade. Then at nightfall the thieves broke out bourbon and rum. They did not post a guard. They thought no one would come. Who would dare to confront them? Who'd dare interfere? What with all of their weapons, they'd nothing to fear. Then one pulled out a fiddle. They danced in the night. They were rowdy and rude, an embarrassing sight. And they left our friends dangling, did not cut them down. This is hard to believe, Martin said with a frown. But Sir Ray was still cheerful, despite their tight spot. He said, "We'll never rest till these rascals are caught." Thus the plight of our friends sure appeared pretty grim. And that's when they heard a voice whisper to them, "Would you like some help?" The voice came from the leaves. They did not move a muscle, or hiccup, or sneeze. They just stared into darkness in search of the voice. They'd take anyone's help. They did not have a choice. Something moved a bit closer and crept through the leaves. Martin nervously looked down below at the thieves. But the brigands now slept. They all noisily snored, lying there with their weapons, an ill-gotten hoard. Then the light from the fire allowed them to see something standing right there on the limb of a tree. And that something they saw filled our friends with surprise. A camouflaged elf with pale hair and gray eyes. The elf spoke with a voice that was teasing but kind, saying, "Somehow I never expected to find such unusual acorns adorning my oak." Martin wondered if this was some strange elven joke. "I say my oak," he whispered. "Of course it's not mine." Our friend studied the elf, who seemed strange but benign. "I just tend this old forest," he whispered with pride. Then he pulled out a knife from the sheath at his side. With a swipe of the blade, the elf cut our friends free, and they silently dropped to the ground from the tree. But the thieves slumbered on. They had partied too hard. As I mentioned before, they did not post a guard. The elf hopped down beside them and said that they should slip away in the darkness as fast as they could. But Ray whispered, "Let's catch them, let's tie them up tight, put an end to their thievery, stop it tonight." "We're outnumbered," said Martin. "It's 6 against 3. I say that we're loose, since the elf cut us free. We should run to the village and summon the law." The bold dog agreed, though it stuck in his craw. Then they turned to the elf, and they gave him their thanks. But something made noises, loud clatters and clanks. And when Martin crept over to where his things lay, which he wanted to grab before getting away, he bent down and he gathered his crown and his sword. It was then that they bumped a most clangorous chord. Martin stopped and he froze. What a dreadful mistake! He looked at the thieves. His knees started to shake. The thieves stirred, and they woke, and they jumped to their feet. They all drew out their weapons, not missing a beat. It was 6 against 3. That's not a fair fight, and the prince was to blame for their desperate plight. "Don't you move," growled the boss, "if you value your life." He glared at the boy, and he pointed his knife. Though he weighed only 98 pounds soaking wet, with the blade in his hands, the boss posed a real threat. With the elf at their side, our friends braced for a fight. A deep voice then called out and split the dark night. "Lay a hand on my friend and I'll tear you apart." The boss was surprised, and he turned with a start. And then out from the shadow emerged a dark shape. The boss couldn't believe it. He stood there agape. The thing's yellow eyes flashed in the light of the fire. Shining fangs were revealed for the boss to admire. It was lanky and lean, and it glared at the thief. And the boy was astonished, then sighed with relief. In the light of the fire he recognized John. He had stealthily managed to sneak up upon the 6 thieves in the night. What a sight for sore eyes! Martin hadn't expected this pleasant surprise. And then 8 other wolves came, confronting the crooks, who were clearly concerned and exchanged nervous looks. For these wolves were not tame. They looked ready to fight. All those yellow eyes flashed in the bonfire light. The 5 highwaymen looked for some sign from the boss. This was quite unexpected. They felt at a loss. And Sir Ray said, "It looks like the tables have turned." And the boss had recovered. His anger now burned, and he lunged at the lad, quite a dastardly dare, as John the wolf leapt, and he flew through the air. And the beast bit down hard on the boss's right arm, half a second before that big blade could do harm. And the weight of the wolf dragged the boss to the ground. They were evenly matched, inch for inch, pound for pound. The foes rolled in the dirt, and their fight was a blur of glistening steel, gleaming fangs, and gray fur. The wolf dodged the thief's blade, which would slash at thin air. Then he'd fight with his fangs, which would rip and would tear. Oh, the sounds of their combat would curdle your blood. All the growls and snarls, the terrible flood of harsh curses that came from the mouth of the thief. His minions were shocked, stared in pure disbelief. Though their struggles were epic, it ended real fast. This was not John's first fight, and would not be his last. When it came to a brawl, John was one of the best. Soon he stood there on top of his enemy's chest. The wolf growled in his face and looked hard in his eyes. But the boss looked away. He did not try to rise. He just raised up his hands. He'd run plumb out of fight. He had to surrender. He feared the wolf's bite. When the gang saw him lying, immobile with fear, their own courage failed, and they did not cohere. One thief bolted and ran, tried to get far away, but he wasn't as fast as the knight named Sir Ray. That bold dog ran him down, knocked him hard to the deck. Then he dragged the thief back by the scruff of his neck. Another attempted to climb up a tree. An interesting choice. That was one way to flee. But the elf saw the thief, and his lasso soon whirred. He aimed at the bandit, his lasso unfurled. The elf roped the big rascal and jerked him right back, and the thief hit the ground with a bone-jarring smack. There were 3 brigands left. Their chances were slim. Then Prince Martin stepped up and spoke sternly to them. "Drop your daggers and clubs and those swords in the dirt. If you quickly obey, no one else will get hurt." For a moment, the thieves thought they could make a last stand, but they knew they were beaten, outmatched and outmanned. The young prince looked fierce with his crown and his sword, to say nothing of the wolves who could not be ignored. And that dog with those teeth, and that elf with the bow, things were much different now than mere minutes ago. So they raised up their hands, they admitted defeat, and they dropped all their weapons, which piled at their feet. The elf tied the thieves up. They could not fight or run. It was then the dawn broke, the first rays of the sun. Then the boy, dog, and elf thanked the Timberwolf pack. John decided to stay, but the rest headed back. As the wolves loped away to return to their lair, Ray looked hard at the thieves, and he said, "Don't you dare even think of escaping. So far we've been nice. I'm warning you once, I will not tell you twice." Then he said to his friends, "This is what we should do. We 4-legged creatures can handle this crew. We'll have no trouble keeping these crooks under paws, while you 2-legged fellows go summon the law." "That sounds fine," said the boy, who then turned to the elf. Martin asked if he'd first tell them more of himself. With a wink at the wolf, whom he'd met once before, the elf said that he hailed from a far distant shore. "I was born Theodosius," he sheepishly said, "but for obvious reasons, I just go by Ted. I'm assigned to this forest, I tend to the trees. Taking care of this woodland is my expertise. I was deep in the woods when I got the report that some crooks had arrived of the very worst sort. A brave doe and her fawn brought this unwelcome news. I stopped where I stood, there was no time to lose. I made haste through the trees till I came to this sight, when I saw the 6 thieves and your terrible plight. I was glad I could help." The elf modestly grinned. Then he said to the prince, "We must hurry, my friend. Let's go climb to my treehouse up high in the oak, where we'll send some signals of puffy black smoke that will summon the sheriff to ride here with speed, to lock these crooks up for their criminal greed." So the 2 of them left, through the forest they raced, to the treehouse where Ted's operations were based. When they reached a huge oak, Ted announced, "Here's our stop. Now we climb and we climb till our ears start to pop." The boy stood there in awe. What a sight to behold! The tree was at least several thousand years old. He could not see the top. Yes, the tree was that tall. Standing next to this wonder, he felt very small. Then they started their climb. They moved up limb by limb. Martin followed the elf and stuck closely to him. They at last reached a platform and stood there to rest. Martin panted for breath. His lungs burst from his chest. "It gets easier now," the elf said to his friend. Then he tugged on a rope. They began to ascend, for they stood on a lift Ted himself had devised. "Hang on tight to the rope," the elf gravely advised. Then they glided straight up to Ted's home in the sky, a towering treehouse 500 feet high. They stepped into the house through a red-painted door, but they first wiped their feet on the mat on the door. Martin looked out a window, and my, what a view! Way up there, things looked different. The sky was so blue. There before him he saw an expanse of great trees, and the clouds were so close, floating by on the breeze. The elf went to his hearth, and he built a big fire, which belched out black smoke that went higher and higher. And the puffs of smoke signaled the crooks had been caught. Ted provided coordinates, marking the spot. Then he said, "While we wait for the sheriff's reply, may I give you a tour of my home in the sky?" The elf's house was a wonder, just what you'd expect of an elf who'd be told to preserve and protect a whole forest of trees and the creatures therein. I'd like to describe it, but where to begin? He had weapons aplenty affixed to the walls, and coils of rope to prevent deadly falls. He had maps of the forest spread out for review. He had logbooks and charts, and a portrait or two of the elves who had tended these trees long before. He had tall stacks of books full of tree-tender lore. And to go with his lassos and arrows and bows, he had wardrobes that hung with his camouflaged clothes. Soon the sheriff replied they could see puffs of black. This ended the tour. Now the friends headed back. They descended the oak, and they lit on the ground. They ran back to the place where the thieves had been bound. All the thieves were still there. They had not moved an inch. A mere glance from Big John or Sir Ray made them flinch. "A whole posse is coming," Ted said with a smile, "to lock these thieves up and commit them for trial." It sure didn't take long for the law to arrive, and the sheriff was pleased they'd been taken alive. He had 6 different posters he slowly unrolled. Each depicted a man and said "Wanted" in bold. He examined the thieves, who were inked up and scarred, then compared the 6 posters. He studied them hard. He looked back at the boss, whom he loudly addressed. "Robert Snooks, you delinquent! You're under arrest." Then he said to the crooks who composed Robert's crew, "And I'm placing you cutthroats in custody too." Then among all the loot, Martin found a wood chest, and it was the Duke's with his emblem and crest. It had been on his wagon until it got robbed. When the chest was recovered, the boss loudly sobbed. Then the sheriff announced he'd return all the loot. He was honest and held in the highest repute. Then he said the Duke posted a handsome reward for the person who captured the thieves and their hoard. He removed a small pouch, which he tossed to the boy. "Here are 16 gold coins. They're now yours to enjoy." Then the posse connected the prisoners with chains, and they gathered up all of their ill-gotten gains. Then the sheriff said "Thanks" to the friends with a smile, and the lawmen set out with the thieves single file. As they dragged him to jail, the boss blubbered and cussed as the rest of the gang looked away in disgust. Now the 4 brave companions were all that remained. The boy couldn't believe all the gold he had gained. At first Martin was shocked, and he stood in a daze, then insisted they share it. "Let's split it 4 ways." But his friends wouldn't have it. They all 3 agreed that Prince Martin should keep it. They simply'd no need. It would just weigh them down. They had nothing to buy. "I suppose that I'll keep it," he said with a sigh. The reward was now his to be spent as he wished. His 3 friends were so happy, 2 tails even swished. Then Sir Ray said, "Why don't we head back into town to that blacksmith whose weapons have won him renown? Since it's market day, he'll be set up on the mall. He'll be hawking his steel from his weaponry stall." And young Martin looked up, and he started to smile. He completely forgot the axe for a while. He'd simply been too busy to think of the axe, what with tree houses, bandits, and timber wolf packs. The companions thus walked till they reached the town square, and they got a few looks. People stopped just to stare. They went straight to the stall with the broadswords and mail. Martin hoped the great weapon would still be for sale. And it was! And the boy, he had just enough gold. He must buy it up quickly before it got sold. The boy picked up the axe. What a sight to behold! With the axe in his hands, he felt daring and bold. He imagined himself going out for a ride, atop a great war horse, the axe at his side. Then a nearby commotion disrupted his thoughts, before the big axe had been wrapped up and bought. They all turned to the scene, to the stall right next door. Ray and Martin saw someone they'd both seen before. That bedraggled old tramp they'd seen begging for bread. He looked even worse. He still hadn't been fed. He had gone to the grocer's to beg for some food, but the grocer said, "Shoo!" He was snappish and rude. The old beggar looked haggard and grizzled and gaunt. Martin looked at the axe, and he badly did want to complete the transaction, so strong was its grip. This was a dilemma. He chewed on his lip. He looked back at the beggar, now sitting nearby, and he thought of the coins and what else they could buy. Then he turned to Sir Ray. They exchanged a long look. Then the axe slowly put the axe back in the hook. Then he said to the blacksmith, "I think that I'll pass." Then he walked towards the beggar, who sat on the grass. He went up to the tramp and said, "Pardon me, sir." The townspeople stared. He was causing a stir. Why on earth would the prince go and talk to that man? He was tattered and filthy and smellier than some of yesterday's trash or a pig in the muck. Many eyebrows were raised. The tongue started to cluck. The tramp wasn't the kind they preferred on the street, not a person to talk to or smile or greet. He was not wearing shoes. He was missing some teeth. He just tramped into town and ranked way down with all the townsfolk, who viewed the poor man with disdain. Could he not just move on? Why must he remain? He just wasn't the type that they wanted around. So when Martin approached him, they grimaced and frowned. But the prince didn't care. No, Prince Martin knelt low by the beggar, who flinched as if fearing a blow. And the prince touched his arm, looked him right in the eyes. The man timidly stared, full of shock and surprise. It had sure been a while since he felt a kind touch, and he thought of a hound whom he missed very much. "What's your name?" asked the prince. "The name's Tim," he replied. "Will you tell me your story?" The poor fellow sighed. The tramp spoke in a drawl, and he told of his past. He'd had a good life, but it unraveled fast. He was born in the South, and he fought in the war. Then he'd worked many years in a mapmaker's store. He had saved up his wages with one goal in mind. He would buy the first coach that was cheap he could find. Tim at last bought a coach, and he'd ridden the roads, driving village to village, delivering loads. He had only one friend, a dependable hound, who would sit there beside him as Tim rode around. And then one day, some brigands jumped out to attack. Tim tried to resist, but the thieves broke his back. Then they kicked out some teeth, and they busted his head. He drove off in his coach, and they left him for dead. And the worst part of all was the fate of the hound, who lay quiet and still beside Tim on the ground. Tim had somehow survived, but could not earn a wage. He was 3/4 crippled and starting to age. That was 3 long years past, and he'd begged ever since. That was the story the tramp told the prince. The prince paused for a moment, absorbing the tale. He was no longer thinking of axes for sale. Then he pulled out his pouch, which he put in the hand of the man who just stared and did not understand. The prince smiled at the man and said, "It won't bite." The man slowly untied it, And oh, what a sight! He just couldn't believe it. Was this a cruel joke? A small crowd had now gathered, but nobody spoke. "For these 16 gold coins you won't hunger again," said the prince to the man, with a shy, boyish grin. "It will pay for a room, no more nights on the street. It gets colder out west, we get snowfall and sleet. And there might be enough to acquire a team of 2 mules and a coach to rekindle your dream." Tim's eyes narrowed at first, then they opened up wide. They filled up with tears, and the old fellow cried. Then the prince helped him up, got him back to his feet. Tim smiled at the prince, and he said, "Time to eat." Epilogue. The prince blushed just a bit as he walked to his friends. He had learned that kind acts always pay dividends. They had helped out the wolf, who then said he'd help them. Then the tree tender helped when they'd hung from the limb. Then the beast paid them back. Yes, it sure saved the day when Big John and his wolf pack had jumped in the fray. This had helped them recover the Duke's precious chest. How it all came together, well, who would have guessed? And from that moment on, good Prince Martin would heed any person he found who was hurt or in need. All right, guys, that's it for today. Hi, bud. Yes, I know. Tomorrow I will be reading a funny book. Yeah, there you go, bud. Ugh, covered in drool. Tomorrow I'll be reading a funny book. Best ages probably 7 and up would be appropriate. Again, if you have any requests that you'd like me to read, please send me a note or post here, and I will talk to you guys tomorrow. Bye.